The case file hit the table with a dull thud, and every pair of eyes in the cramped staff room at St. Mary's Teaching Hospital turned toward Amara Johnson. Dr. Edward Howard stood over her with that familiar smirk playing at the corner of his mouth, the one that said he'd already decided how this would end. "Here, Miss Johnson," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume for the interns clustered by the coffee station to hear every word. "Let's see if our nursing student can solve something even senior residents struggle with." The laughter started small, nervous chuckles from Liam Carter and Sophie Bennett, but it spread like wildfire through the room, and Amara felt the heat crawl up her neck as she stared down at the impossibly thick manila folder now sitting in front of her. If you want more emotional hospital stories like this one, hit that subscribe button now and join thousands who never miss an update. Amara's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the file, and she hated herself for that momentary weakness, for letting anyone see even a flicker of the fear that was threatening to choke her. This was St. Mary's Teaching Hospital, one of London's most prestigious medical facilities, and she was the only black female nursing student on Dr. Howard's rotation, a fact that hadn't escaped anyone's notice in the 3 months she'd been assigned to his team. She'd worked twice as hard as anyone else, stayed twice as late, studied twice as many cases, and still there were moments like this, moments when she was handed not an opportunity but a test designed for her to fail. The hospital drama unfolding in front of her wasn't about medicine at all, it was about proving something she'd been forced to prove her entire life, that she belonged here, that her intelligence and her instincts and her dedication weren't somehow less valid because of the color of her skin. Daniel Hughes, a third-year medical resident, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, watching with barely concealed anticipation, waiting for the entertainment to begin, and Amara realized with sudden clarity that this rare diagnosis case wasn't just difficult, it was meant to be impossible, a puzzle so complex that her inevitable confusion would confirm every bias already lurking in the minds of the people surrounding her. She opened the file and the pages spilled across the table like an accusation. Lab results that contradicted each other, symptom charts that made no logical sense, notes from 4 different consultants all pointing in completely different directions. The patient, a 53-year-old woman named Catherine Wells, had been in and out of hospital for 6 weeks with a constellation of problems that included unexplained fever, joint pain, a rash that appeared and disappeared without warning, kidney function that was deteriorating, and neurological symptoms that ranged from mild confusion to full-blown seizures. 3 specialists had already admitted defeat. The infectious disease team thought it might be an unusual presentation of sepsis, but the antibiotics did nothing. Rheumatology suspected lupus, but the markers weren't quite right. Neurology was leaning toward a rare form of encephalitis, but the spinal tap came back clean. Every test seemed to rule out the previous theory without offering anything concrete in return, and the patient was getting worse, her body slowly shutting down while the brightest minds in the hospital stood around arguing about differentials and ordering more scans that revealed nothing useful. Dr. Howard was speaking again, his voice dripping with that particular brand of condescension Amara had learned to recognize from professors and supervisors who never quite believed a black nurse could bring anything valuable to the table. "You've got 2 hours, he announced, checking his watch with theatrical precision. "We'll reconvene at noon and you can present your findings to the team. Should be educational for everyone." The way he emphasized that last word made it clear what kind of education he expected, the kind where failure became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when people reach beyond their station. Sophie Bennett actually giggled, quickly covering her mouth when nurse supervisor Margaret Ellis shot her a warning look from across the room, but the damage was done, the atmosphere was set, and Amara was alone on a stage she'd never asked to climb. She gathered the file close to her chest and walked out of the staff room without a word, her head held high even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The corridor outside was quieter, the familiar sounds of the hospital wrapping around her like a strange kind of comfort. The beep of monitors, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the distant murmur of patients and families navigating their own private disasters. Amara found an empty corner in the ward, a small desk wedged between 2 storage closets where the nursing students usually filled out paperwork, and she spread Catherine Wells' file across the surface like a map to buried treasure. Her hands had stopped shaking now, replaced by the cold focus that always descended when she was truly challenged, when backing down stopped being an option and pushing forward became the only way to breathe. This emotional hospital story was hers now, and she was going to solve it. She started from the beginning, ignoring the consultant notes and the competing diagnoses, focusing instead on the raw data, the timeline of symptoms, the patient's own words recorded in nursing notes that most doctors never bothered to read. Amara had learned early in her nursing education that patients told you everything if you just knew how to listen, that the small details everyone else dismissed often held the keys to the entire puzzle. Catherine Wells had mentioned that her symptoms started about 3 months ago, right after a hiking trip to the countryside where she'd been bitten by something, probably a tick, though she couldn't be certain. The doctors had tested for Lyme disease immediately, but the results were negative, so they'd moved on to more exotic possibilities. But something about that timeline nagged at Amara, something familiar she couldn't quite place, a memory dancing just beyond her conscious grasp. She thought back to her volunteer work, the 6 months she'd spent at a rural clinic in Cornwall before starting her nursing program, a tiny facility that served farming communities and saw all sorts of unusual cases that never made it to the textbooks. There had been a patient there, an older man with similar symptoms, the same confusing presentation that had the local GP completely stumped. Amara had been just an observer then, barely allowed to take vitals, but she remembered how the visiting infectious disease specialist had finally cracked the case, remembered the way everyone in that small clinic had gathered around to hear about a condition so rare that most healthcare professionals went their entire careers without encountering it. The name swam up from the depths of her memory like something precious being retrieved from deep water. Powassan virus, a tick-borne illness so uncommon that testing for it wasn't part of the standard panel, a disease that could mimic dozens of other conditions and was only getting more prevalent as climate change shifted the ranges of the ticks that carried it. Amara's pulse quickened as she cross-referenced Catherine's symptoms with everything she remembered about that case in Cornwall. The neurological symptoms that came and went, the joint pain, the kidney involvement, the fever that spiked and fell without pattern. It all fit. Powassan was a diagnostic nightmare because it progressed in stages, because it could look like viral encephalitis one day and autoimmune disease the next, because the standard testing protocols didn't include the specific antibody assays needed to detect it. Most doctors never even considered it because it was so rare, maybe a few dozen cases a year in the UK, but that rarity was exactly what made it the perfect hiding place for a disease that wanted to kill its host while everyone argued about what to call it. She dove deeper into the file, looking for confirmation for any detail that would either support or destroy her theory. The rash Catherine had experienced was described as erythematous and macular, appearing primarily on the trunk and extremities, consistent with Powassan. The seizures had started mild and gotten progressively worse, also consistent. The kidney involvement suggested the virus had reached the point of systemic inflammation, which meant they were running out of time. Amara felt the weight of that realization settle over her shoulders like a physical thing, heavy and demanding. This wasn't just about proving Dr. Howard wrong anymore. This wasn't just about defending her dignity or earning respect. This was about a woman lying in a bed 3 floors above her. A woman whose body was failing while everyone stood around being brilliant and wrong. The 2 hours passed like minutes, and suddenly Amara was gathering her notes, organizing her thoughts, preparing to walk back into that staff room and face the firing squad that was waiting for her. Her stomach twisted with anxiety, but underneath that fear was something stronger, a bedrock certainty that she was right, that her nursing instincts and her critical thinking and her willingness to look beyond the obvious had led her to the answer everyone else had missed. She thought about her mother, who'd worked as a healthcare assistant for 30 years and told her daughter 1,000 times that nursing excellence wasn't about memorizing facts, it was about seeing the whole patient, about connecting dots that seemed unrelated until suddenly they formed a picture no one else could see. She thought about every time someone had underestimated her, every skeptical look and dismissive comment, every moment when being a black woman in a white-dominated profession meant working twice as hard for half the recognition. The staff room fell silent when she walked in, and Amara felt the weight of every gaze land on her like a physical pressure. Dr. Howard stood at the front of the room with his arms crossed, that same infuriating smirk still playing at his lips, clearly expecting a performance that would validate everything he already believed about nursing students who didn't know their place. Liam Carter had his phone out, probably ready to record what he thought would be a humiliating stumble. Sophie Bennett whispered something to Daniel Hughes that made him snicker. But Margaret Ellis, the nurse supervisor who'd been working at St. Mary's for 25 years, caught Amara's eye and gave her the smallest nod of encouragement, a gesture that said someone in this room believed in her, someone knew what she was capable of. "Well, Miss Johnson," Dr. Howard began, his tone already laced with condescension, "I'm sure you've had a very educational morning. Why don't you share with us what you've discovered?" He emphasized that last word as if the very idea of her discovering anything was absurd, as if this entire exercise was just a formality before they all moved on to more important matters. The interns were already smiling, ready for the punchline. Amara took a breath, placed her notes on the table and began to speak, her voice steady and clear, every word carefully chosen. Catherine Wells presents with a complex symptom pattern that has been misinterpreted as multiple separate conditions when it's actually a single rare diagnosis that explains everything. She saw Dr. Howard's eyebrow raise, saw the first flicker of something that might have been surprise cross his face. The key is in the timeline and the initial exposure. 3 months ago, following a rural hiking trip and a suspected tick bite, she began experiencing symptoms consistent with tick-borne illness. The standard Lyme panels came back negative, so that avenue was abandoned, but there are other tick-borne diseases that don't show up on routine testing. She pulled out a chart she'd created, mapping Catherine's symptoms against the typical progression of different conditions. The neurological symptoms, the confusion, the seizures, combined with the inflammatory markers and the multisystem involvement point to viral encephalitis, but not the common varieties. The rash pattern, the joint involvement, the kidney dysfunction, and the specific timing all align with Powassan virus, a rare tick-borne flavivirus that requires specialized antibody testing to detect. The room had gone completely quiet now, the smirks fading into uncertain expressions. Powassan isn't included in standard diagnostic panels because it's so uncommon, which is exactly why it's been missed. But if we look at the epidemiology, cases have been increasing in rural areas where the deer tick population has expanded due to climate change. Catherine's hiking location places her directly in a known Powassan endemic region. Amara continued, walking through each piece of evidence, each symptom that supported her conclusion, her nursing-based knowledge of patient observation and pattern recognition giving her a perspective that the doctor's focus on exotic differentials had somehow missed. She explained how the disease progressed, why the treatments so far had been ineffective, and what needed to be done immediately to confirm the diagnosis and begin appropriate supportive care. We need to order Powassan virus IgM and IgG antibodies through the reference lab, she concluded, meeting Dr. Howard's eyes directly. And we need to start aggressive supportive therapy for the neurological symptoms because this disease has a mortality rate of 10% and a significant chance of permanent disability if not managed properly. The silence that followed her presentation was deafening. Sophie Bennett's mouth had actually fallen open. Liam Carter had lowered his phone, his expression shifting from amusement to shock. Daniel Hughes was leaning forward, suddenly interested in a way he hadn't been before. But it was Dr. Howard's face that told Amara everything, the way his smirk had completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably close to uncertainty. He cleared his throat, glanced at the senior residents as if looking for support, then back at Amara. "That's quite a theory," he said slowly, and she could hear him working to maintain his authority. "Powassan virus is extraordinarily rare. The likelihood increases significantly when you account for geographic exposure and eliminate the more common diagnoses," Amara interrupted, her confidence growing with every word. "Every test so far has been negative for everything else. We're running out of time and this patient is deteriorating. What do we have to lose by testing for it?" Margaret Ellis stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of decades of nursing experience. "The girl makes a compelling case, doctor. And she's right that we're running out of options. If there's even a chance she's identified what everyone else missed, we owe it to the patient to investigate." The implicit support from a respected nurse supervisor seemed to tip the balance, and Amara watched Dr. Howard's face cycle through several emotions before landing on reluctant agreement. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "We'll order the Powassan panel. But I want it on record that this is highly speculative." He said it like he was covering himself, like he was already preparing for the moment when he could say he'd never really believed in this nursing student's wild theory, but Amara didn't care about his ego anymore. She cared about Catherine Wells, about the shocking hospital twist that might just save a life. The next 6 hours were agonizing, a slow stretch of time where Amara couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything except waiting for those results to come back from the reference laboratory. She visited Catherine's room, stood at the foot of the bed watching the woman sleep restlessly, her body fighting a war against an enemy no one had properly named until today. The patient's daughter was there, a woman in her 30s who looked exhausted from weeks of watching her mother decline without explanation, and when she asked Amara if there was any news, any hope, Amara wanted to promise her something but could only offer a quiet, "We're working on it," that felt inadequate against the weight of uncertainty. It was nearly 8 in the evening when Margaret Ellis found Amara in the nursing station, her hand gentle on the younger woman's shoulder. "The results are back," she said softly, and Amara's heart stopped. They walked together to the conference room where Dr. Howard had assembled the team, and the moment Amara saw his face she knew before he said a single word, before he cleared his throat and looked down at the paper in his hands. "The Powassan virus antibody test is positive," he announced, his voice carefully neutral. "IgM and IgG both elevated, consistent with acute infection. Miss Johnson's diagnosis was correct." The room erupted, but not with laughter this time, with shocked murmurs and excited conversations. Residents pulling out their phones to look up information about a disease most of them had only vaguely heard of, nurses who'd been listening from the doorway breaking into spontaneous applause that made Amara's eyes burn with unexpected tears. Sophie Bennett actually apologized, walking over with genuine contrition in her face, saying, "I completely underestimated you, that was brilliant." And Liam Carter was already telling everyone in earshot about how the nursing student had solved the impossible case. The hospital teamwork that had been absent before suddenly materialized, everyone coming together to implement the treatment protocol, to notify infectious disease specialists, to give Catherine Wells the fighting chance she deserved. But it was Dr. Howard's approach, later that evening when the commotion had died down, that Amara would remember most clearly. He found her at the same small desk where she'd spent those crucial 2 hours, and he stood there for a long moment before speaking, his pride clearly wrestling with his honesty. "I underestimated you," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him something. "That was wrong. Your diagnostic thinking was exceptional, better than most senior residents I've worked with. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and that's not the kind of physician I want to be." He extended his hand, and Amara shook it, feeling the strange mix of vindication and exhaustion that came with winning a battle she'd never wanted to fight. "For what it's worth," he added, "I'll be recommending you for the Dean's Award for Clinical Excellence. What you did today saved a patient's life." The news spread through St. Mary's Teaching Hospital like wildfire, the inspirational nurse story passing from department to department, floor to floor, until everyone knew about the black nursing student who diagnosed what the doctors couldn't, who turned a moment meant to humiliate her into a demonstration of pure medical excellence. The patient survival rate for Powassan virus improved dramatically with early diagnosis and aggressive supportive care, and Catherine Wells began to respond to treatment within 48 hours, her fever breaking, her neurological symptoms stabilizing, her kidneys showing signs of recovery. Her family asked to meet Amara personally, and the daughter gripped her hands with tears streaming down her face, saying, "You saved my mum's life. No one else even knew what to look for. You saved her." In the weeks that followed, something shifted at St. Mary's. Nursing students found themselves being consulted more often on difficult cases, their observations and insights treated with the respect they'd always deserved. Margaret Ellis used Amara's case in training sessions, teaching new nurses about the importance of critical thinking and patient-centered observation. Dr. Howard, to his credit, changed his approach with students, becoming less dismissive and more collaborative, though Amara suspected he'd never fully shake the embarrassment of being shown up by someone he tried to belittle. But the most profound changes happened internally, in the way Amara moved through the hospital now, in the confidence that came from knowing she'd earned her place not through luck or charity but through genuine skill and determination. When graduation day arrived 6 months later, Amara walked across that stage to receive her nursing degree with her head high and her mother weeping proudly in the audience, and when the dean called her name to receive the award for clinical excellence, the entire auditorium rose in standing ovation. She was no longer just a nursing student fighting to be seen, she was a fully qualified nurse whose diagnostic abilities had already saved a life, whose story had inspired countless other young women of color to believe they could thrive in spaces that didn't always welcome them. St. Mary's offered her a permanent position in the acute care ward, and she accepted, knowing she'd found her calling in those intense moments of crisis where sharp thinking and compassionate care intersected to pull patients back from the edge. Years later, nurses would still tell the story of Amara Johnson, the black nurse who solved the impossible diagnosis, who turned a cruel joke into a defining moment of hospital respect and excellence, who proved that brilliance could come from anywhere if you were just willing to look past your prejudices and listen. Catherine Wells made a full recovery and would visit Amara every year on the anniversary of her diagnosis, bringing flowers and gratitude for the nursing excellence that had given her back her life. And every time a new group of nursing students rotated through St. Mary's, Margaret Ellis would tell them about that day in the staff room, about the thick case file and the mocking doctor and the young woman who refused to be broken, using it as a reminder that the joke meant to belittle her became the moment that defined her career, the day she became not just a nurse but a legend.